Jake Martinez was lying under the main engine when the alarms started blaring throughout the ship New Horizon. He had been fixing a coolant leak that had been bothering him for 3 days. His flip-flops were kicked off to the side, and his cargo shorts were stained with engine oil. The old band shirt he wore had more holes than fabric at this point, but it was comfortable and lucky. The alarm meant only one thing: contact with something that was not human. Jake rolled out from under the engine and grabbed his tools. He slipped his feet back into his flip-flops and walked toward the bridge. Other crew members were running past him, but Jake never ran unless something was actually on fire. In his experience, most emergencies turned out to be much less urgent than people thought. Captain Lisa Rodriguez was standing in the center of the bridge staring at the main screen. Jake had never seen her look so serious. The screen showed a massive ship that looked like it was made of crystal and metal twisted together in impossible ways. It was beautiful and terrifying at the same time. The ship was easily 10 times larger than the New Horizon. Strange lights pulsed along its surface in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Jake squinted and tried to make sense of what he was seeing. The engineering part of his brain wanted to understand how something that big could even move through space. A voice came through the communication system. It did not sound human. The words were clear, but there was something wrong with the way they were arranged. It was like listening to someone speak who had learned language from a book, but had never actually talked to another person. "We are the vessel, eternal wisdom of the Galactic Confederation. You have entered our space without permission. Prepare to be boarded for inspection and evaluation." Captain Rodriguez stepped forward and activated the response channel. "This is Captain Lisa Rodriguez of the human vessel New Horizon. We come in peace and wish to establish diplomatic contact. We were not aware this was your territory." There was a long pause. Jake could hear the hum of the ship engines and the quiet beeping of various instruments. Everyone on the bridge was holding their breath. "Humans, we have heard rumors of your species. You have achieved faster than light travel recently. This is unexpected. We will board your vessel to conduct proper first contact protocols." Jake felt his stomach drop. First contact with aliens. This was the moment that would change everything for humanity. And he was standing there in flip-flops and shorts covered in engine grease. A bright light appeared on the bridge, and 3 figures materialized. Jake blinked hard and tried to process what he was seeing. The tallest figure looked like it was made of living crystal. It was nearly 8 feet tall, and its body reflected light in ways that made it hard to focus on. The other 2 were smaller, but no less strange. One looked like a walking tree made of metal, and the other was covered in what appeared to be flowing liquid that changed colors. The crystal being stepped forward and spoke. "I am Ambassador Zeth Kara of the Galactic Confederation. We have come to evaluate your species for potential membership in our organization." Captain Rodriguez straightened her uniform and tried to look official. "Welcome aboard, Ambassador. We are honored by your presence and eager to learn about your confederation." The ambassador looked around the bridge with what Jake assumed was curiosity, though it was hard to tell with a crystal face. The being seemed to be taking notes on some kind of device that looked like a small floating sphere. "Your ship design is crude but functional. Your technology appears to be in its early stages but shows promise. However, your crew appears to be dressed inappropriately for such an important occasion." Jake looked down at himself and realized the ambassador was looking directly at him. He was the only person on the bridge not wearing a proper uniform. Captain Rodriguez followed the ambassador's gaze, and her face turned red. "This is Jake Martinez, our chief maintenance engineer. He was working when you arrived and did not have time to change into formal attire." The ambassador moved closer to Jake and examined him like he was an interesting specimen. Jake could smell something like ozone and copper coming from the crystal being. The ambassador reached out with one finger and poked Jake's shirt where one of the larger holes was located. "This garment appears to be damaged beyond repair. Why do you continue to wear it?" and these foot coverings appear to offer no protection or support. Are all humans so careless with their equipment? Jake felt his face getting hot. The shirt was comfortable, and the flip-flops were practical for working in the engine room, where he often had to take his shoes off anyway. But he could not exactly explain that to an alien ambassador. During first contact, they are comfortable and practical for my work, Jake said quietly. The ambassador made a sound that might have been laughter, but sounded more like glass breaking. Comfort over function. Practical over proper. This confirms our initial assessment. The floating sphere near the ambassador began projecting images into the air. Jake could see recordings of humans doing various activities. People playing sports, people working, people relaxing. All of it looked perfectly normal to Jake, but the ambassador seemed to find it all very amusing. Your species exhibits chaotic thought patterns. You prioritize individual comfort over group efficiency. You waste time on activities that serve no productive purpose. You appear to solve problems through random trial and error, rather than logical analysis. Captain Rodriguez stepped forward. With respect, Ambassador, we have achieved spaceflight and faster-than-light travel. Our methods may be different from yours, but they are effective. The ambassador turned back to the sphere, and more images appeared. These showed human inventions and discoveries throughout history, but the way they were presented made everything look accidental or crude. Yes, you have achieved these things, but through what you call luck and intuition rather than proper scientific method. Your technology works, but you often do not understand why it works. You build things and then figure out how they function afterward. Jake wanted to argue, but he had to admit there was some truth to what the ambassador was saying. Half the repairs he made were based on hunches and experience rather than textbook procedures. Sometimes he fixed things by hitting them or rigging solutions that should not work, but did. The ambassador moved to the center of the bridge and began speaking in a more formal tone. After careful observation and analysis, we have determined that humanity shows potential, but is currently too primitive for full membership in the Galactic Confederation. You think in chaos rather than order. You prioritize emotion over logic. You are unpredictable and unreliable. The words hit Jake like a physical blow. Primitive, chaotic, unreliable. He had never thought of humanity that way, but hearing it from an advanced alien species made him question everything. However, the ambassador continued, we are not without mercy. We offer humanity junior membership in the Confederation. You will be allowed to observe and learn from advanced species until you have evolved beyond your current limitations. Captain Rodriguez looked like she wanted to argue, but Jake could see her forcing herself to remain diplomatic. What would this junior membership involve? You would be assigned a mentor species to guide your development. Your technology would be monitored and approved before implementation. Your expansion into space would be carefully controlled. In exchange, you would have access to basic Confederation knowledge and protection. Jake felt anger building in his chest. They were treating humanity like children who could not be trusted with sharp objects. But before he could say anything, the ambassador spoke again. Of course, you must first prove that you are worthy of even junior membership. This will be determined through our traditional trial of champions. The bridge fell silent. Jake could hear his heart beating and the distant hum of the ship engines. Captain Rodriguez cleared her throat carefully. What does this trial involve? One representative from your species will face our current champion in a test of skill, intelligence, and adaptability. If your representative succeeds, humanity will be granted junior membership. If they fail, humanity will be quarantined to your current solar system until you have matured sufficiently. Jake felt his stomach drop even further. The fate of the entire human race was going to be decided by a single contest. And based on what he had seen so far, the aliens were far more advanced than humans in every way that mattered. The ambassador looked around the bridge again, and Jake saw the crystal being gaze lingering on each crew member. Captain Rodriguez stood straighter, clearly preparing to volunteer herself. She was the obvious choice: military training, leadership experience, and formal education. But then the ambassador pointed directly at Jake. "We choose this one as your representative." The bridge erupted in protests from the crew, but the ambassador raised a hand for silence. Jake stood there in shock, staring at the crystal finger pointing at him. "But he is just a maintenance worker," Captain Rodriguez said desperately. "Surely you would prefer someone with more formal training." The ambassador made that glass-breaking sound again. "Exactly. If this represents your best, then humanity is indeed primitive. If he can somehow succeed, then perhaps you have hidden potential we have not recognized. It will make for an interesting test." Jake looked around the bridge at his fellow crew members. They all looked as shocked as he felt. Captain Rodriguez looked like she wanted to argue further. The next morning Jake found himself standing in the transport bay of the Eternal Wisdom. The alien ship was even more impressive on the inside than it had looked from the outside. The walls seemed to be alive with flowing patterns of light, and the floor felt soft under his flip-flops, like it was adjusting to each step. Captain Rodriguez walked beside him, along with Dr. Kevin Park, the ship's xenobiologist. Dr. Park had spent the entire night trying to learn everything he could about alien psychology and biology from the limited data they had gathered. Jake had spent the night trying not to think about what he was walking into. Ambassador Zeth Kara met them at the entrance to what it called the challenge chamber. The crystal being seemed to shimmer more brightly today, and Jake wondered if that meant it was excited or amused, or something else entirely. "Welcome to the heart of our vessel. This chamber has hosted the trial of champions for over 3,000 of your years. Many species have attempted the challenge. Most have failed." The chamber was enormous. The ceiling stretched up so high that Jake could not see the top, and the walls curved away in all directions. Strange symbols covered every surface, and they seemed to move and change when he was not looking directly at them. In the center of the chamber stood another alien. This one was clearly built for combat. It had 6 arms that moved with perfect coordination, and its body was covered in what looked like natural armor. Its eyes were large and multifaceted like an insect, but they held an intelligence that was both impressive and intimidating. "This is Vexion, our current champion. Vexion has won 847 consecutive challenges over the past 200 years. No being has come close to defeating Vexion in over a century." Vexion stepped forward and examined Jake with obvious curiosity. The champion moved with a fluid grace that made Jake feel clumsy just watching. When Vexion spoke, its voice was like music played on instruments Jake had never heard. "So this is the human representative. It appears even smaller and more fragile than I expected. Are you certain this creature can even survive the physical challenges?" Jake bristled at being called a creature, but he kept his mouth shut. Getting angry would not help anything right now. Instead, he tried to study Vexion the way he would study a complex machine. He needed to understand. The champion was clearly stronger and faster than any human. Those 6 arms could probably work on multiple tasks simultaneously with perfect coordination. But there was something in the way Vexion moved that reminded Jake of a computer program. Everything was precise and calculated and efficient. "Ambassador." Zeth Kara activated some kind of control, and the chamber around them began to change. Platforms rose from the floor, and strange mechanical devices descended from the ceiling. Within minutes they were standing in what looked like an elaborate obstacle course, mixed with a testing laboratory. The trial of champions consists of 3 phases. The first phase tests physical capability and adaptability. The second phase tests strategic thinking and leadership. The third phase tests creative problem-solving under pressure. Each phase becomes more difficult than the last. Jake looked around at the course and felt his confidence dropping. There were walls to climb, ropes to swing from, and moving platforms that looked like they would require perfect timing to navigate. It was clearly designed for beings much more athletic than a human maintenance worker. The course adapts to each challenger. It analyzes your capabilities and adjusts the difficulty to provide an appropriate challenge. This ensures that victory comes from skill and intelligence rather than simple physical superiority. That made Jake feel slightly better. At least he would not be expected to match Vexion's raw physical capabilities. But it also meant the course would find ways to challenge him that he could not predict or prepare for. Dr. Park stepped forward and addressed the ambassador. May we observe the champion demonstrating the course? It would help us understand what our representative will face. The ambassador considered this request. It is unusual, but not forbidden. Vexion, would you be willing to demonstrate? The champion moved to the starting position with obvious pride. Jake watched carefully as Vexion began moving through the course. Every movement was perfect. The champion used all 6 arms to maximum advantage, climbing and swinging and balancing with mechanical precision. What impressed Jake most was how Vexion seemed to analyze each obstacle for exactly 1 second before moving. No wasted motion, no hesitation, no trial and error. It was like watching a computer program execute perfectly designed code. But it was also completely predictable. Jake found himself thinking about how he would approach each obstacle differently. Not better necessarily, but differently. Where Vexion saw the intended solution, Jake saw alternative possibilities. The champion completed the course in what appeared to be record time, and returned to the starting position without even breathing hard. Jake noticed that Vexion had used every obstacle exactly as it was designed to be used. Perfect form, perfect technique, perfect efficiency. Impressive. Captain Rodriguez said diplomatically. Vexion moved to stand near Jake. Your turn, human. Show us what your species considers capable. Jake walked to the starting position and looked out at the course. Up close, it looked even more intimidating. But something about Vexion's demonstration had given him an idea. The champion had treated the course like a test with right and wrong answers. But what if there were no wrong answers? What if the course was just a collection of problems waiting for creative solutions? Jake kicked off his flip-flops and picked them up. Captain Rodriguez looked horrified, but Jake just grinned at her. If he was going to do this, he might as well do it his way. The first obstacle was a smooth wall, about 20 feet high, with small handholds placed at regular intervals. Vexion had climbed it using 4 arms, while the other 2 maintained perfect balance. Jake looked at the wall and noticed something the champion had not used. There were support struts running up the backside, where the wall connected to the main structure, instead of using the handholds. Jake walked around to the back of the wall and started climbing the support struts. They were not designed for climbing, but they provided better grip and more stable footing than the intended handholds. It was not elegant, but it worked. The next obstacle was a series of rotating platforms that had to be crossed at exactly the right moment. Vexion had calculated the timing perfectly and moved across with mechanical precision. Jake watched the platforms for a moment and noticed that they were not perfectly synchronized. There was a point where 3 platforms aligned in a way that created a stable bridge across the entire gap. Jake waited for the alignment and then simply walked across. No timing required, no athletic ability needed, just patience and observation. By the 4th obstacle, Jake was starting to enjoy himself. Each challenge was like a broken machine that needed fixing, and Jake had been fixing broken machines his entire adult life. The key was not to think about how things were supposed to work, but how they actually did work. The final obstacle was a rope swing across a pit filled with some kind of glowing liquid. Vexion had used 2 arms to swing while the other 4 maintained perfect form and balance. Jake looked at the rope and noticed it was attached to a pulley system that allowed for adjustment. Instead of swinging across, Jake adjusted the pulley to lower himself down until he could simply step across a narrow part of the pit. Then he readjusted the rope to pull himself back up on the other side. Not athletic, but effective. Jake completed the course in slightly more time than Vexian, but without any of the athletic ability the champion had displayed. When he returned to the starting position, he was breathing hard but grinning. Ambassador Zethkara looked confused. "You did not complete the obstacles as they were designed." Jake shrugged and slipped his flip-flops back on. "You said the course tests adaptability." "I adapted." Vexian studied Jake with new interest. "You used the structural elements rather than the intended path. You waited for optimal conditions rather than forcing your way through. You modified the equipment to suit your needs. This is not how challenges are typically approached." Jake could not tell if the champion was impressed or annoyed. Different does not mean wrong. Sometimes the best solution is the one nobody expects. Dr. Park looked fascinated. "You approached each obstacle like an engineering problem rather than a physical challenge. You optimized for efficiency rather than demonstration of capability." The ambassador made several notes on its floating device. "This is indeed unusual. Most species attempt to prove their superiority through dominant displays. You chose to prove your intelligence through creative interpretation." Jake was starting to understand something important about the aliens. They were incredibly advanced and intelligent, but they seemed to think in very rigid patterns. They had rules and procedures and established methods for everything. That could be a strength, but it could also be a weakness. Phase 1 is complete. The results are inconclusive. We will proceed to Phase 2 immediately. The chamber began changing again. The obstacle course dissolved back into the floor and was replaced by what looked like a command center with multiple screens and control panels. Jake had never seen anything like it, but it reminded him of the simulator programs he had used during his brief time in engineering school. Phase 2 tests strategic thinking and leadership capability. You will each command a virtual fleet in simulated combat. The scenario will test your ability to adapt to changing conditions and coordinate complex operations. Vex. Jan moved to one of the control stations with obvious familiarity. The champion hands began moving across the controls with the same mechanical precision Jake had seen in the physical course. Within seconds, the screens showed a fleet of ships. Moving into formation, Jake approached his own control station and stared at the bewildering array of buttons and screens. Everything was labeled in alien symbols that meant nothing to him, but underneath the strange interface, he could see the basic structure of what appeared to be a tactical simulation. The scenario began, and Jake found himself commanding a fleet of 30 ships against an enemy force of unknown size and capability. Vexian fleet moved with perfect coordination, following what appeared to be textbook military formations. Jake had no military training and no experience with space combat, but he did have experience with complex systems, and he understood that every system had weaknesses that could be exploited by someone willing to think creatively. While Vexian built traditional battle formations, Jake started experimenting with the control interface. He divided his fleet into small groups and began testing different combinations of movement and attack patterns. Most of his experiments failed, but each failure taught him something new about how the simulation worked. By the time the enemy fleet appeared on the tactical display, Jake had discovered several interesting features of the simulation that Vexian did not seem to be using. The champion was playing by established rules while Jake was still learning what the rules actually were. The battle was about to begin, and Jake realized he was probably going to lose badly. But losing did not necessarily mean failure. Sometimes the best way to understand a system was to break it in interesting ways. The tactical simulation exploded into action around Jake as enemy ships appeared on his displays. Vexian fleet moved like a perfect machine, with ships falling into classical battle formations that Jake recognized from old military documentaries. The champion was clearly following established tactical doctrine that had been refined over centuries of warfare. Jake stared at his own fleet scattered across the tactical display in what any military instructor would call chaos. His experimental formations looked random and disorganized compared to Vexian's yawn precise arrangements. But Jake had learned something important during his testing phase. The simulation was not just a game, it was based on real physics and real engineering principles. Ships had power limitations, fuel consumption rates, and structural stress points. Weapons had charging cycles and accuracy degradation over distance. Most importantly, the AI controlling the enemy fleet was programmed to respond to recognized tactical patterns. Vex Yan opened the battle with a classic pincer movement designed to surround and overwhelm the enemy force. It was textbook perfect, and exactly what the enemy AI was programmed to counter. The AI response was immediate and devastating. Enemy ships moved to block the pincer, while long-range weapons began picking off Vex-Yan lead ships. Jake watched the opening moves, and saw something that made him grin. The enemy AI was very good at countering standard tactics, but it seemed confused by his scattered formation. Enemy ships kept starting to move toward his units, and then stopping, as if they could not decide which group posed the most threat. Instead of trying to fight the enemy directly, Jake decided to treat the battle like a complex engineering problem. What was the most efficient way to achieve the victory conditions with the least amount of resources and risk? He started by sending his smallest ships on seemingly random patrol routes throughout the battlefield. They were too small to pose a real threat, but they forced the enemy AI to track multiple contacts and divide its attention. While the AI was trying to analyze his patrol patterns, Jake quietly moved his heavy ships into positions that made no tactical sense, but provided excellent engineering advantages. Vex-Yan battle was proceeding exactly as expected. The champion ships were trading fire with enemy forces in a grinding battle of attrition. Both sides were losing ships steadily, but Vex-Yan's superior coordination was slowly gaining the advantage. It was professional and efficient, and completely predictable. Jake waited until both fleets were fully engaged, and then activated a plan that would have made any military strategist laugh. Instead of concentrating his firepower on the strongest enemy ships, he targeted the weakest ones, but he did not try to destroy them. Instead, he used precise shots to disable their engines and weapons systems. The disabled ships became obstacles that interfered with enemy movement patterns. The AI kept trying to route around them, but Jake damaged ships were positioned in exactly the right places to disrupt standard tactical formations. Soon the enemy fleet was struggling to maintain cohesion while navigating around their own disabled units. Dr. Park was watching the displays with fascination. He is not trying to win through superior firepower. He is using the battlefield itself as a weapon. Ambassador Zeth Kara made notes on its floating device, but said nothing. Jake could see the crystal being was confused by his tactics, but did not want to interrupt the simulation. Vex-Yan had gained a significant advantage in the conventional battle, and was pressing forward to finish the enemy fleet. But Jake was implementing the second phase of his plan. While the champion was focused on the main engagement, Jake had been quietly moving his fastest ships to capture the enemy supply depot that most commanders ignored during battle simulations. The moment Jake's ships reached the depot, the entire tactical situation changed. The enemy fleet suddenly lost its ammunition and fuel resupply, which meant their remaining ships were operating on limited resources. More importantly, Jake now controlled the depot weapons, which were designed for orbital bombardment rather than ship-to-ship combat. Jake had never used orbital bombardment weapons before, but he understood the basic principle. They were designed to attack fixed targets on planetary surfaces, which meant they had enormous power, but terrible accuracy against moving ships. However, they were perfect for creating obstacles and area denial effects. Jake began using the depot weapons to create energy barriers and debris fields that further disrupted enemy movement. He was not trying to destroy enemy ships directly. Instead, he was making it impossible for them to operate effectively as a coordinated fleet. Vex-Yan noticed Jake's unconventional strategy and began adapting. The champion started using similar area control tactics, while maintaining superior coordination and firepower. For several minutes, it looked like Vexion would overcome Jake's environmental advantages through sheer tactical superiority. But Jake had been studying the simulation interface more carefully than anyone realized. During his initial experiments, he had discovered that the simulation was not just running military scenarios. It was actually modeling a complex industrial conflict where victory could be achieved through economic and logistical means, as well as direct combat. While Vexion was focused on destroying enemy ships, Jake quietly captured the asteroid mining facilities that provided raw materials for ship construction. He also seized control of the trade routes that connected different parts of the battlefield. Suddenly, Jake was not just fighting the enemy fleet. He was controlling the entire economic foundation that supported enemy operations. The enemy AI began making increasingly desperate moves as its resource base collapsed. Ships started running out of ammunition and fuel. Damaged vessels could not be repaired because Jake controlled the manufacturing facilities. The proud enemy fleet began falling apart, not from battle damage, but from simple logistics failure. Vexion realized what was happening and tried to counter by attacking Jake's economic targets. But the champion had spent the entire battle optimizing for direct combat. Vexion's ships were out of position and low on resources from the extended firefight. Meanwhile, Jake had been conserving his forces and positioning them to defend his captured facilities. The simulation declared victory for Jake's team when the enemy fleet surrendered rather than face complete economic collapse. Vexion had won the military battle decisively, but Jake had won the war through unconventional means. The tactical displays faded, and the command center dissolved back into the basic chamber structure. Jake stood up from his control station and stretched. His back was sore from hunching over the unfamiliar interface, and his brain felt tired from processing so much new information. Vexion approached him with an expression that Jake could not interpret. The champion, 6 arms moved in complex patterns that might have been respect, or confusion, or frustration. You did not fight the battle. You fought the system that supported the battle. This is not how military simulations are typically approached. Jake shrugged. I am not a military officer. I am an engineer. Engineers solve problems by understanding systems and finding the most efficient solutions. Ambassador Zethkara was making extensive notes. You treated the simulation as an engineering challenge rather than a tactical exercise. You optimized for resource efficiency rather than combat effectiveness. You achieved victory through systemic disruption rather than direct confrontation. Dr. Park looked excited. This demonstrates a fundamental difference in human thinking patterns. Where other species see competition, we see problem solving. Where they see tests, we see puzzles. Captain Rodriguez had been quietly observing the entire simulation. Jake, that was brilliant. You found victory conditions that the simulation designers probably never expected anyone to use. Jake felt embarrassed by the praise. I just did what made sense to me. The simulation had all these economic and industrial elements, so I figured they must be important for something. Vexion continued, studying Jake with those large, multifaceted eyes. You achieved victory through means I had not considered. This suggests that human thinking patterns may have value despite their apparent chaos and inefficiency. The ambassador activated its controls, and the chamber began changing again. This time the transformation was more dramatic. The walls stretched higher, and strange geometric shapes descended from the ceiling. The floor became soft and responsive like it was alive. Lights appeared in patterns that seemed to move through dimensions Jake could not perceive. Phase 3 will test creative problem-solving under pressure. This challenge is different for every participant. The chamber will generate a unique problem that has never been solved before. There are no established solutions, no tactical doctrines, and no previous examples to follow. Jake looked around at the bizarre environment forming around them. Everything was shifting and changing in ways that hurt his eyes to follow directly. Shapes merged and divided in patterns that defied geometry. Colors appeared that he did not have names for. Both challengers will face the same problem simultaneously. The first to find a viable solution will be declared the winner. However, the solution must be genuine and sustainable. The chamber can detect false or temporary answers. Vexian moved to what appeared to be a starting position near one of the geometric constructs. The champion began examining the strange shapes with methodical precision, using all 6 arms to probe and measure and analyze. Jake walked to his own starting area and tried to make sense of what he was seeing. The geometric shapes were clearly interactive, but they responded to touch in ways that seemed random. Colors changed, patterns shifted, and new elements appeared and disappeared without apparent logic. The challenge appeared to be some kind of multi-dimensional puzzle that combined elements of mathematics, physics, and spatial reasoning. Jake had no training in advanced mathematics, and his understanding of physics was limited to practical engineering applications. But as he studied the shifting patterns, Jake began to recognize something familiar. The random appearing changes were not actually random. They were following rules that reminded him of the diagnostic patterns he used when troubleshooting complex machinery. Every machine had its own personality, and quirks that could only be learned through experience. The same malfunction might manifest differently in different units, depending on environmental factors, manufacturing variations, and usage patterns. The key was not to memorize every possible combination, but to understand the underlying principles that governed system behavior. Jake stopped trying to analyze the puzzle intellectually and started approaching it the way he would approach a broken engine. He began experimenting with different inputs and carefully observing the outputs. He paid attention to timing and sequence and context. Slowly, a pattern began to emerge. The puzzle was not actually about mathematics or physics. It was about communication. The geometric shapes were trying to tell him something, but they were using a language based on spatial relationships and temporal sequences rather than words or symbols. Jake started responding to the puzzle inputs with his own spatial patterns. He moved his hands in sequences that mirrored what he was seeing. He traced shapes in the air that echoed the geometric transformations happening around him. The puzzle began responding more actively to his inputs. Colors became brighter patterns, became more complex, and new elements appeared that seemed designed specifically for human interaction. Jake realized he was not solving the puzzle so much as learning to communicate with it. Vexian was still approaching the challenge through systematic analysis, trying to decode the mathematical relationships that governed the puzzle behavior. The champion was making progress, but it was slow and methodical. Jake had found a completely different approach. Instead of trying to understand the puzzle, he was trying to establish a relationship with it. He was treating it like a sentient system that wanted to communicate rather than a problem that needed to be solved. The breakthrough came when Jake stopped thinking about solutions entirely and started thinking about partnership. He began working with the puzzle to create new patterns that neither he nor the system could generate alone. The result was something beautiful and complex, and completely unprecedented. The chamber announced that Jake had achieved a successful solution, but what surprised everyone was that his solution continued to evolve and improve, even after the challenge was officially complete. He had not just solved the puzzle. He had created an ongoing collaborative relationship with it. Vexian stopped working and approached Jake's solution with obvious amazement. The champion studied the continuing pattern evolution for several minutes before speaking. You did not solve the puzzle. You became part of it. This is not a solution I would have considered possible. Jake was still interacting with the geometric patterns and enjoying the way they responded to his movements. It feels less like solving and more like dancing. The puzzle wants to work with us, not against us. Ambassador Zeth Kara was recording everything with obvious excitement. This approach suggests possibilities we had not previously considered. Most species treat challenges as obstacles to overcome. Humans apparently treat them as opportunities for collaboration. The chamber began returning to its normal configuration, but Jake could see that some elements of his collaborative pattern remained embedded in the basic structure. He had not just completed the challenge, he had permanently changed the chamber itself. Phase 3 is complete. The results are unprecedented. We must proceed immediately to final evaluation. The chamber filled with representatives from dozens of alien species, as word of the unprecedented trial spread throughout the Confederation fleet. Jake had never seen so many different forms of life in one place. There were beings made of energy, and others that appeared to be living metal. Some floated through the air, while others moved on limbs. He could not count. All of them were watching him with expressions. He could not interpret, but he could feel their attention like physical weight. Jake looked down at his flip-flops and torn shirt and wondered what these advanced beings thought about humanity being represented by someone who looked like he had just crawled out from under a broken engine. Ambassador Zeth Kara stood in the center of the chamber, addressing the assembled representatives. The trial has proceeded through all 3 phases, with results that challenge our fundamental assumptions about intelligence and capability. The human representative has demonstrated approaches that are unprecedented in Confederation history. A being that looked like a giant insect with crystals growing from its back spoke in a voice like breaking glass. Unprecedented does not mean effective. Chaos may occasionally produce interesting results, but it cannot be relied upon for consistent performance. Another alien that appeared to be made of flowing liquid joined the conversation. The human methods lack the precision and predictability we require from Confederation members. How can we integrate a species that solves problems through random experimentation? Jake felt his temper rising, but Dr. Park caught his eye and shook his head slightly. Getting angry would not help humanity. 'Cause right now, instead Jake tried to listen and understand what the aliens were really concerned about. Vexion stepped forward and the chamber fell silent. The champion had not spoken since the final phase ended, and everyone seemed curious about the official evaluation. I have competed in the Trial of Champions for over 2 centuries. I have faced representatives from every major species in the galaxy. I have studied every known approach to problem-solving and tactical thinking. The human representative has shown me something entirely new. The crystal insect being made a sound, like grinding stone. New does not necessarily mean better. The established methods exist because they are proven effective. Vexion turned to face the critic directly. Effective within known parameters, yes. But what happens when we encounter problems that do not fit within those parameters? What happens when our proven methods are insufficient? The champion began activating controls around the chamber, and the walls filled with displays showing various galactic conflicts and challenges. Images of wars that had lasted centuries appeared, alongside problems that had never been solved despite massive resource allocation. These are situations where traditional approaches have failed. Military conflicts where superior firepower could not achieve victory. Technical challenges where advanced knowledge could not provide solutions. Diplomatic crises where logical analysis could not find acceptable outcomes. Jake studied the displays and saw patterns that reminded him of stuck projects he had worked on. Sometimes the hardest problems required stepping back and approaching them from completely different angles. The human representative demonstrated 3 distinct approaches that we have not previously considered. In the physical challenge he treated obstacles as engineering problems rather than tests of capability. In the tactical simulation he focused on systemic disruption rather than direct confrontation. In the creative challenge he sought collaboration rather than domination. A new voice joined the discussion. This one belonged to a being that looked like a tree made of metal with lights flowing through its branches. These approaches may work individually, but do they represent a sustainable methodology? Can they be taught and replicated, or are they dependent on random inspiration? Dr. Park stepped forward with permission from Captain Rodriguez. If I may address that concern. We have studied human problem-solving patterns extensively. What appears random is actually highly systematic. Humans use intuitive pattern recognition combined with experimental testing. We call it iterative design. The metal tree being flickered its lights in what might have been curiosity. Explain this process in more detail. Dr. Park activated his portable display and began showing examples of human innovation throughout history. Humans observe systems and form hypotheses about how they work. We then test those hypotheses through small-scale experiments. Each experiment provides new information that refines our understanding. This process continues until we achieve desired results. Jake watched the presentation and recognized his own approach to fixing broken machinery. He had never thought of it as a formal methodology, but Dr. Park was right. He did follow a consistent process of observation, hypothesis, and testing. But the key insight is that humans are comfortable with failure during the experimental phase. We expect most attempts to fail, and we learn from each failure. This allows us to explore solution spaces that other species avoid, because they appear too risky or uncertain. The flowing liquid being rippled in what Jake interpreted as skepticism. This suggests that human methods are inherently wasteful and inefficient. Why pursue approaches that are likely to fail when proven methods are available? Captain Rodriguez joined the discussion. Because proven methods only work for known problems. When we encounter something genuinely new, we need approaches that can adapt and evolve. Human methods may be less efficient in controlled conditions, but they are more robust in unpredictable situations. Ambassador Zethkara had been recording everything, and now it activated the central display. Let us examine the specific results achieved during each phase of the trial. The display showed detailed analysis of Jake performance compared to Vex Yan and historical champions. The numbers were complex, but the basic patterns were clear. Jake had achieved equivalent, or superior, results using completely different methods. In Phase 1, the human representative completed the course using 30% less energy than the champion while achieving the same time. This was accomplished through creative interpretation of the available resources. Jake grinned as he remembered climbing the support struts and adjusting the pulley system. He had not been trying to be efficient. He had just been looking for the easiest way to get where he needed to go. In Phase 2, the human representative achieved victory conditions that were theoretically possible, but had never been attempted in over 3,000 years of simulation history. The solution demonstrated understanding of systemic relationships that our tactical experts had not previously considered. The tactical simulation had been like a complex puzzle with multiple layers of interaction. Jake had treated it like a malfunctioning industrial system, where the key was understanding how all the components affected each other. In Phase 3, the human representative achieved a collaborative solution that continued to evolve and improve after completion. This type of ongoing development had never been observed in previous trials. That had been the most fun part for Jake. Once he stopped trying to solve the puzzle and started trying to work with it, everything became easier and more interesting. Vex Yan activated additional displays, showing long-term projections. But the most significant result is what these approaches suggest about scalability and adaptation. Human methods appear to improve with complexity rather than being overwhelmed by it. The chamber filled with discussion as different species debated the implications. Jake could not follow most of the conversations because they were happening in multiple languages simultaneously, but he could sense the growing excitement and uncertainty. A being that looked like a collection of floating geometric shapes spoke in harmonics that hurt Jake's ears. This presents a fundamental challenge to Confederation methodology. If human approaches are genuinely superior in unpredictable situations, then our existing protocols may be inadequate. The crystal insect being made more grinding sounds, or these results could be anomalous. A single trial is insufficient evidence to overturn established principles that have guided the galaxy for millennia. Ambassador Zethkara called for silence in the chamber, gradually quieted. The debate could continue indefinitely, without resolution. We must make a decision based on the evidence available. Jake felt his heart racing as he realized the moment of truth had arrived. The fate of humanity was about to be decided by aliens, who were fundamentally questioning their own assumptions about intelligence and capability. There is another factor we must consider. The human representative achieved these results while operating under significant disadvantages. No formal training in any of the required disciplines. No advanced technology or equipment. No preparation time or strategic planning. Jake looked down at his flip-flops and realized the ambassador was pointing out how unprepared he had been. But instead of making him look incompetent, it apparently made his performance more impressive. This suggests that human capabilities may be inherent rather than trained. If this is accurate, then humanity could provide perspectives and solutions that no other Confederation species can offer. Vex. Jan stepped forward for the final evaluation. I have competed against the finest representatives of every major species in known space. I have never been challenged by approaches I could not predict or counter. The human representative showed me that my understanding of problem solving was incomplete. The champion paused and looked directly at Jake. You did not defeat me through superior strength, or intelligence, or technology. You defeated me by thinking, in ways I had never considered. This suggests that human cognitive patterns represent a genuine evolutionary advantage. Ambassador Zethkara made final notes on its recording device. Based on the evidence presented and the unprecedented nature of the demonstrated capabilities, I hereby declare that humanity has not only qualified for Confederation membership, but has earned full status immediately. The chamber erupted in sounds that Jake assumed were expressions of surprise from the various alien species. He felt his knees go weak with relief and had to sit down on the floor. Captain Rodriguez was grinning widely, and Dr. Park looked like he wanted to start taking notes on every alien present. Jake just sat there in his flip-flops, trying to process what had just happened. However, Ambassador Zethkara continued, this decision comes with an unprecedented requirement. Humanity will be assigned as consulting specialists for problems that have resisted conventional solutions. Your unique approaches will be studied and integrated into Confederation methodology. Jake looked up at the ambassador. You want us to help solve problems that nobody else can figure out. Precisely, your species appears to excel at finding solutions in situations where traditional approaches have failed. This is a valuable capability that could benefit the entire galaxy. Vexion approached Jake and extended one of its 6 hands. It has been an honor to compete against you. I hope we will have opportunities to work together in the future. I believe I could learn much from human problem-solving methods. Jake stood up and shook the offered hand. The champion grip was firm, but not overwhelming. I think I could learn a lot from you too. You have skills and knowledge I cannot imagine. As the various alien representatives began to disperse, Jake found himself surrounded by beings wanting to study human thinking patterns. Some wanted to understand the experimental methodology Dr. Park had described. Others were curious about intuitive pattern recognition and collaborative problem solving. Captain Rodriguez eventually rescued him from the crowd of curious aliens. We should return to our ship and report this development to Earth. This changes everything for humanity. Jake followed her toward the transport bay, but stopped to look back at the chamber, where strange geometric patterns were still evolving in the walls. His collaborative solution with the puzzle had become a permanent part of the alien technology. Dr. Park noticed his pause. You realize what you have accomplished here. You have not just earned membership for humanity. You have demonstrated that our way of thinking has value that even the most advanced species in the galaxy did not recognize. Jake shrugged and adjusted his flip-flops. I just fixed some problems the way that made sense to me. Turns out that was enough. As they walked back to the new horizon, Jake could not help smiling. Humanity had been called primitive and chaotic and unreliable. But sometimes chaos was exactly what the universe needed. 3 months after the trial of champions, Jake found himself standing in another alien chamber, but this time the circumstances were completely different. Instead of being dismissed as primitive, humanity was now being consulted on problems that had stumped the galaxy's greatest minds for centuries. The current crisis involved a massive space station called Deep Harmony that had been designed as a diplomatic meeting place for the most advanced species in the Confederation. The station represented the pinnacle of galactic engineering and had cost more resources than most species produced in a lifetime. Unfortunately, Deep Harmony had stopped working properly 6 months ago, and nobody could figure out why. The station systems were failing in patterns that made no logical sense. Environmental controls would malfunction in some sections while working perfectly in others. Transportation systems would randomly redirect passengers to wrong destinations. Communication networks would translate languages incorrectly, despite using proven algorithms. Ambassador Zeth Kara had requested human assistance after conventional repair attempts had failed completely. Jake was part of a team that included Captain Rodriguez, Dr. Park, and 3 other human engineers who specialized in complex systems. The station command center was filled with representatives from the most technically advanced species in known space. Jake recognized some of them from the trial, including Vexion, who had become something of a collaborative partner in studying human problem-solving methods. The station chief engineer was a being called Nexus Prime that appeared to be made of living metal and energy. When it spoke, its voice resonated through multiple dimensions, simultaneously creating harmonics that Jake could feel in his bones. We have conducted comprehensive analysis of all station systems. Every component tests within normal parameters. Individually, all software algorithms are functioning correctly. All power distribution networks are stable. Yet the station continues to malfunction in ways that defy explanation. Jake studied the diagnostic displays that covered the walls of the command center. The data was overwhelming in its complexity, but he could see patterns that reminded him of problems he had encountered before. Not the specific technical details, but the overall shape of the malfunction. A crystalline being that looked like a living gemstone activated additional displays. We have replaced every questionable component. We have updated all software to the latest versions. We have recalibrated every sensor and communication device. The problems persist without apparent cause. Captain Rodriguez stepped forward. Have you considered that the issue might not be with individual components, but with how they interact as a complete system? The gemstone being flickered with what Jake interpreted as dismissive amusement. Of course, we have analyzed system interactions. Our models account for every possible combination of component behaviors. The mathematical models show that the station should be functioning perfectly. Dr. Park pulled out his portable analyzer and began taking readings. What about environmental factors that might not be accounted for in the original design? Human experience suggests that complex systems often behave differently in real conditions than in laboratory simulations. Nexus Prime resonated with mild irritation. The station environment is completely controlled. Temperature, humidity, radiation levels, and electromagnetic fields are all maintained within precise specifications. There are no variables that could affect system performance. Jake had been listening to the discussion while studying the diagnostic patterns. Something about the malfunctions reminded him of a problem he had encountered years ago. With a manufacturing plant that had started producing defective products despite all equipment testing normally. Can I see the original design specifications for the station? Jake asked quietly. The question seemed to surprise the assembled aliens. Nexus Prime activated controls, and the walls filled with incredibly detailed technical drawings and specifications. The complexity was staggering, with millions of interconnected systems designed to work in perfect harmony. Jake studied the designs for several minutes, trying to understand the basic architecture. The station was designed like a massive machine, where every component had a specific function and precise relationships with every other component. It was elegant and efficient and completely rigid. "Who lives and works on the station currently?" Jake asked, the gemstone being answered without thinking. "Representatives from 47 different species, along with their support staff. Approximately 12,000 individuals total, representing the greatest diversity of intelligent life ever assembled in one location." Jake felt something click in his mind. The manufacturing plant he remembered had failed because the original design assumptions were too narrow. The engineers had optimized for one specific type of production, but the plant was being used for multiple different products that created unexpected interactions. "Can you show me the patterns of malfunction, overlaid with the locations and activities of different species?" The request seemed odd to the aliens, but they complied. New displays appeared, showing the station layout with malfunction reports mapped against population distribution and activity patterns. The correlation was immediately obvious to Jake, but it seemed to surprise everyone else. The malfunctions were not random at all. They were clustered around areas where different species interacted most frequently. The station was not broken. It was being overwhelmed by complexity it had never been designed to handle. "The problem is not technical," Jake said slowly. "The problem is social." Every alien in the room made sounds of confusion or disagreement. Nexus Prime resonated with what Jake was learning to recognize as frustrated disbelief. Social factors cannot affect technical systems. The station components operate according to physical laws, not social preferences. Jake pointed to the correlation patterns on the displays. "Look at the data. Every major malfunction occurs in areas where multiple species are trying to use the same systems simultaneously. The station was designed assuming each species would use technology in predictable ways, but reality is much messier." Dr. Park was studying the patterns with obvious excitement. "Jake is right. The station artificial intelligence is being overwhelmed by behavioral patterns it was never programmed to handle. Different species have different approaches to using technology, and the AI cannot reconcile the conflicting inputs." Captain Rodriguez joined the analysis. "The environmental controls are failing because different species have different definitions of comfortable conditions. The transportation system is confused because different species navigate and request destinations in different ways. The communication system cannot handle the complexity of translating between 47 different languages and cultural contexts simultaneously." Vexion moved closer to study the displays. "This suggests that the station is functioning exactly as designed, but the design assumptions were inadequate for the intended use case." Jake nodded enthusiastically. "It is like trying to run 47 different types of software on a computer that was only designed for one operating system. Everything conflicts with everything else, and the system cannot handle the complexity. The gemstone being flickered rapidly. "But the mathematical models predicted perfect compatibility between all species requirements. The design was optimized for maximum efficiency and minimal conflict." "That is exactly the problem," Jake said. "You optimized for an ideal situation that does not exist in reality. Real people do not behave like mathematical models. They have preferences and habits and quirks that cannot be predicted or controlled." Nexus Prime seemed to be processing this information with difficulty. "Are you suggesting that the station cannot be repaired through technical means?" Jake grinned and picked up his toolkit. "No, I am suggesting that we need to approach the repair differently. Instead of trying to force the system to work perfectly, we need to make it flexible enough to handle imperfection." Over the next several hours, Jake worked with the human engineering team to implement what they called adaptive compatibility protocols. Instead of trying to make all the species behave the same way, they modified the station systems to recognize and accommodate different behavioral patterns. The environmental controls were reprogrammed to create microclimates that gradually transitioned between the preferences of different species. The transportation system was modified to interpret navigation requests based on the cultural context of each user. The communication system was enhanced with cultural translation protocols that considered context and intention, rather than just literal meaning. Most importantly, they added what Jake called chaos buffers to every major system. These were adaptive protocols that could handle unexpected inputs and unusual usage patterns without breaking down. The improvements were not elegant or efficient by traditional engineering standards. They were messy and complicated and required constant adjustment. But they worked. Within days, the malfunction reports dropped to almost zero. More importantly, the station began operating in ways that were actually better than the original design. Species that had never been able to work together effectively began collaborating on projects that none of them could have completed alone. Ambassador Seth Kara arrived to observe the results and seemed amazed by what it found. The station is functioning beyond design specifications, despite operating under conditions that should have caused complete system failure. Jake was back in his flip-flops and work clothes, calibrating one of the new adaptive systems. We stopped trying to make it perfect and started trying to make it useful. Turns out, that is a lot more practical. Vexion had been working closely with the human team and seemed to understand the principles behind their approach. You have demonstrated that accommodation of chaos can be more effective than elimination of chaos. This contradicts fundamental Confederation engineering philosophy. Dr. Park was documenting everything for future reference. Human engineering philosophy is based on the assumption that systems will be used in ways the designers never anticipated. We build in flexibility and adaptability rather than trying to control every variable. Nexus. Prime approached Jake with obvious curiosity. Your modifications have improved station performance by 37%, while reducing maintenance requirements by 22%. This should not be possible according to established optimization principles. Jake shrugged while adjusting. A control panel. Maybe your optimization principles are optimized for the wrong things. Sometimes the best solution is the one that works well enough for everyone, rather than perfectly for anyone. The success at Deep Harmony Station led to requests for human consultation on dozens of other problems throughout Confederation space. Jake found himself traveling to alien worlds and space installations, fixing problems that had been considered unsolvable. Every situation was different, but the pattern was always the same. The aliens had created technically perfect solutions that failed when they encountered the messy reality of how different species actually lived and worked. Human engineers specialized in making those perfect solutions, flexible enough to handle imperfection. 6 months after the trial, Jake was sitting in the mess hall of a Confederation research vessel when Captain Rodriguez found him. She had been monitoring requests for human assistance, and the list was growing longer every day. Earth wants to establish a formal diplomatic and technical exchange program with the Confederation. They want you to head the human side of the program. Jake looked up from the engine diagnostic he had been studying. They want me to be a diplomat. I fix machines for a living. Captain Rodriguez smiled. You do a lot more than fix machines, Jake. You fix relationships between different ways of thinking. That is exactly what diplomacy is about. Dr. Park joined them, carrying a stack of reports. The Confederation Science Council wants to fund a comprehensive study of human problem-solving methodologies. They think our approaches could revolutionize how they handle complex challenges. Jake thought about all the aliens he had worked with over the past months. They were incredibly intelligent and capable, but they had been limited by their own assumptions about how things should work. Humans seemed to excel at working with how things actually worked. Do they understand that our methods are not always faster or more efficient? Jake asked. Sometimes the human way takes longer and uses more resources. Dr. Park nodded. But human methods work in situations where their methods fail completely. That makes the extra time and resources worthwhile, Jake. stood up and walked to the viewport where he could see stars that no human had ever seen before. 6 months ago, humanity had been considered too primitive for galactic civilization. Now they were being asked to help solve problems that the most advanced species could not handle. "All right," Jake said finally. "I will head the exchange program, but I have some conditions." Captain Rodriguez raised an eyebrow. "What kind of conditions?" Jake grinned and looked down at his flip-flops. "I get to keep wearing whatever I want to work. And if any alien complains about human methods being chaotic or inefficient, I get to fix their most important broken system using duct tape and rubber bands." Dr. Park laughed. "I think we can arrange that." As Jake watched alien ships moving through space in perfect formations, he thought about how much had changed since that first day when Ambassador Zeth Kara had called humans primitive. The aliens still moved with mechanical precision and mathematical accuracy. But now they were learning to appreciate the beautiful chaos of human creativity. Jake had started as a maintenance engineer, trying to fix a coolant leak. Now he was helping to fix the relationship between order and chaos in an entire galaxy. And he was still doing it in flip-flops. Some things never needed to change.